Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. In 2016, Tex and Diane McIver had spent a hot Sunday in the late September sun in Georgia, playing golf and then going to dinner with a colleague of Diane's in Conyers, a town about a half hour from Atlanta. Danny Jo Carter, Diane's friend and manicurist, had acted as chauffeur for the couple that day after they played golf. She had gone horseback riding at the couple's Putnam County ranch as they golfed, and then they picked her up and she took over driving as they both drank wine in the car as they headed to dinner. After dinner, it was late in the evening as they were headed back to Atlanta in its famous congested traffic, with Danny Jo driving, Diane in the passenger seat, and Tex in the back seat, directly behind his wife. Though red wine had been served at dinner, Tex didn't drink much of it. He didn't like it. But still, on the way home, he struggled to keep his eyes open, exhausted after a full day in the Georgia heat. Diane kept turning around and fussing at her husband, arguing that if he slept on the way home, he wouldn't sleep well that night. As they neared Atlanta, traffic on the downtown connector was a parking lot. Even at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, you can count on Atlanta traffic being the worst. Diane told Danny Jo to take the Edgewood Avenue exit, and then she turned around and told Tex to wake up. When he did, he looked around and realized they were in a midtown area. He said, "Girls, this is a bad idea. This isn't safe." He was talking about the area of Midtown they were in. Diane said, "We'll be on Piedmont shortly." But then Tex said, "Darling, hand me my gun." And Diane reached into the center console and pulled out a snub-nosed .38 revolver wrapped in a plastic bag and handed it to her husband. Tex took the gun and laid it in his lap and then nodded off back to sleep. What happened next would be hotly debated for years, and Tex McIver would go on trial for murdering his wife. There has been a major update in this case since then, and today we're going to go over it. Welcome to episode 210, Update on the Tex McIver case. Four and a half years ago, I released episode 66, Tex and Diane McIver, Accident or Murder. As I said, there has been a major update, and the outcome is sure to reignite strong debate as to whether, as the episode title implies, Tex intended to kill his wife, or whether the tragedy was nothing more than a terrible accident. I have remastered and re-released episode 66 if you want the full deep dive when I originally covered this case. But for now, I'll do my best to summarize before we get into the new court rulings. Late in the evening of September 25th, 2016, 72-year-old Claude Tex McIver and his 63-year-old wife Diane were on their way home in Atlanta, Georgia. Earlier that day, they had braved the heat to play a round of golf, followed by dinner in Conyers with Diane's best friend Danny Jo Carter and one of Diane's colleagues. Afterward, Danny Jo was driving the couple back to the condo they shared in Buckhead. Diane was in the front passenger seat while Tex sat behind her in the back. The couple were each high flyers professionally, extremely successful in their own right, well-connected and wealthy. Tex was a corporate labor lawyer and a partner with a prestigious firm, while Diane was CEO of Corey Enterprises, where she had worked her way up the corporate ladder since starting there as a payroll clerk 46 years earlier. Diane was a shrewd businesswoman whose strong business acumen, directness, and ability to make tough decisions garnered her a tremendous amount of respect. But underneath, she was also a loving and generous person. She was definitely a conservative, though not as obvious with her politics. But her husband was a loyal Republican who served on the American Bar Association Committee on Gun Violence. It was a second marriage for both Tex and Diane, and those who knew them could see how deeply in love they were, even after 5 years of dating and 10 years of marriage. That early fall night, Tex, Diane, and Danny Joe drove back to Atlanta after spending the weekend at the McIver's ranch in Putnam County, where Danny Joe had been riding horses. After Tex and Diane's golf outing, they picked Danny Joe up at the ranch in their Ford Expedition SUV and all went to dinner. Given Tex and Diane both had a few drinks that afternoon and into the evening, Danny Joe was the designated driver on the way home. But as they got closer to the city, the SVU pretty much came to a standstill as traffic was bumper to bumper on the downtown connector. At Diane's suggestion, Danny Joe took the exit at Edgewood Avenue. Tex dozed on and off in the back seat. He had spent hours in the sun earlier that day, and it was late, and he had now had some red wine under his belt, though he wasn't intoxicated. When he awoke after nodding off at one point and saw the area the group was driving through, he felt uneasy, saying, "Girls, this is a bad idea. This isn't safe." Much would later be made of Tex's assessment of this situation, given that Black Lives Matter protesters had been out in force in Atlanta since July, protesting police shootings. For reasons that would later be debated, Tex apparently felt unsafe, telling Diane, "Darlin', hand me my gun." Diane pulled Tex's loaded .38 caliber revolver, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, out of the center console. She handed it back to her husband, and Tex set the gun on his lap before quickly falling back asleep. Not long afterward, the car was stopped at a red light on Piedmont Road when Danny Joe heard what she later described as a big boom. Tex, who had been jolted out of his sleep moments earlier, realized the gun had discharged. Everyone seemed fine at first, but suddenly, Diane realized she had been hit. Breathing heavily, she said, "I've been shot." Tex instructed Danny Joe to drive to Emory Hospital, where Diane made a dying declaration that her husband shot her accidentally. But as Diane deteriorated, with her blood pressure dangerously low and headed into surgery, the doctor asked if she wanted to see her husband. She said no. Maybe she didn't want him to see her in a state she felt would be distressing to him. Maybe she was just too out of it to know what she was saying. Who knows? Her death was a heartbreakingly abrupt ending for the well-known couple who seemed to have it all. Following Diane's death, Tex told the police that he fell asleep with a gun in his lap, and at some point soon after, it fired. He had previously commented at the hospital that the gun discharged accidentally when the car went over a bump. Knowing his actions would be subject to strong scrutiny, and in an attempt at damage control, Tex hired PR consultant Bill Crane. Bill told reporters Tex asked Diane for the gun as he was concerned they were at risk at being carjacked in relation to the recent Black Lives Matter protests, even though there wasn't a protest in the area that night. Bill's comment ignited a storm of debate about Tex's racial bias, but Tex denied it had anything to do with Black Lives Matter. Things got more complicated when, according to Bill, Tex tried to change this narrative, saying he was worried about homeless people in the area, not protesters. These conflicting accounts would later be used against Tex in court. In December 2016, Atlanta PD initially charged Tex with reckless conduct and felony involuntary manslaughter. If convicted, he would face a maximum of 10 years in prison. But in April 2017, Tex was indicted on upgraded charges at the insistence of the Fulton County DA's office. That is important to note. A homicide investigator with 20 years' experience had not believed there was intent or need for the more serious charges. He believed it was a tragic accident. Now, the DA disagreed. Tex now faced one count of malice murder, where intent is the key factor, like first-degree murder in other states, and 1 count of felony murder, similar to second-degree. He was also charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a firearm during a crime, and 3 counts of influencing a witness. But if it was an accident, as Tex claimed, why a malice murder charge? There was understandably a lot of focus on the decisions Tex made in the hours, days, and weeks following Diane's death. Like I said in the original episode, even accounting for the grieving process, Tex showed extremely poor judgment on multiple occasions. When Diane was initially shot, her husband didn't call 911. Instead, he directed Danny Jo to Emory Hospital, which wasn't even the closest medical facility or the most equipped to deal with a gunshot wound. However, Emory Hospital was one of his clients, so he knew how to get there quickly. They didn't call 911 and were rushing Diane to a hospital, so Tex chose the one he knew the way to. But Tex also asked Danny Jo to say she wasn't in the vehicle when the shooting occurred. And it took 2 days for the police to question Tex. Much was made of this delay, making Tex look bad, but we need to remember that the police did not insist on an interview right away. Following Diane's death, Tex asked one of her co-workers if he could draw on his late wife's Social Security. Then he auctioned off Diane's extensive, high-end collection of clothes and jewelry that December on the advice of a lawyer. Regardless of the rationale behind these decisions, they look bad. Some would say quite callous. These things reflected poorly on Tex in the eyes of many. But questionable choices after the fact are not indicative of intent, meaning you can believe that Tex McIver was a rich, white, entitled asshole, but it doesn't mean he murdered his wife. Those who believed it was a case of murder argued that Tex's request to Danny Jo was an attempt to cover up something sinister from the start. But the facts are more nuanced. Tex had been drinking in the hours before handling the gun, and handling a weapon under the influence in itself is an offense, regardless of whatever does or does not happen afterward. So it makes sense that Tex wanted to avoid the repercussions of this, hence his comment to Danny Jo. At Tex's trial in April 2018, the defense submitted that the jury should be able to consider the charge of misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter. In Georgia, this is when someone unintentionally causes the death of another person by engaging in lawful behavior but in an unlawful way. But the request, strongly opposed by the prosecution, was denied by Fulton County Superior Court Chief Judge Robert McBurney. And I do have thoughts on this, which I'll come back to later. In my original episode, I referenced the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's excellent podcast, Breakdown, which covered Tex's trial extensively. In 2022, Vault Studios and 11 Alive WXIA News released a compelling long-form podcast of their own entitled Intent, the Tex McIver Case. If you're after blow-by-blow accounts of Tex's trial and the aftermath, I can recommend both of these as essential listening. And you can watch the entire trial on YouTube. The way Tex's trial played out, you would have thought it was the role of the defense to prove the shooting was accidental, when in reality, it is the state's responsibility to demonstrate the burden of proof that this was a murder. There was a contentious debate from both sides about the question of money. The prosecution case was that Tex wanted Diane dead so he could inherit her multi-million-dollar estate. The court also heard that Tex had recently become much more financially reliant on Diane after he went from equity partner at his law firm to income partner, reducing his annual income from $700,000 to $120,000. However, Tex was in his early 70s and semi-retired, so it's not as though he had gotten some sort of demotion and was panicking about money. He was close to full retirement, but like his wife, he loved working. The defense argued there was absolutely nothing for Tex to gain financially with Diane dead. As she earned more than Tex, he was far better off with her alive so she could continue to support their lavish lifestyle. And also, she could lend her husband money if he needed it. Loaning money was a favor Diane did for those close to her. It might sound a bit unorthodox in the context of a marriage, but Diane and Tex happily kept their finances separate with no issue. They had both gone through ugly divorces from their first marriages, so this arrangement was what they both wanted. It's what worked best for their marriage, which, indisputably, had been a happy marriage for 10 years. Even friends who later turned against Tex could not argue that he and Diane had marital problems. After 5 years of dating and 10 years of marriage, they were still the kind of couple who held hands all the time. Everyone agreed they had an extremely loving relationship. The prosecution also tried to argue the existence of a rumored new will which Diane was said to have made before her death, naming the couple's godson as the sole beneficiary. But no hard proof of such a will was ever produced. All the testimony about Tex and Diane's relationship spoke only to their undying love for one another. There was no mention of conflict, upset, or tension between the couple. At one point during the jury's deliberation, they reached a deadlock on the verdict. Judge McBurney gave them an Allen charge, urging them to continue deliberating until they had an outcome. Finally, after further deliberation, Tex McIver was found guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a firearm during a crime, and influencing a witness. Despite expert evidence, it wasn't possible to confirm whether the gun discharged as a result of a single or double action mechanism. The verdict on the major charges made no sense at all. How can you acquit on malice murder, but convict on both felony murder, which requires the killing to occur during the commission of another felony where intent is involved, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon? Judge McBurney later said in December 2023 that the aggravated assault charge does not allege intent to kill. The jury's decision essentially meant they believed Tex did not intend to kill his wife, but they did believe he intended to seriously harm her. It's difficult to find the logic in that. What would Tex have to gain by maliciously wounding the love of his life? And not just in front of any witness, but in front of her best friend. And why do it in a car anyway? Who leaves themselves open that way if an act is intentional? This too makes no sense. While no one is required to take the stand in their own defense, the fact that Tex chose not to give evidence may have also worked against him in the eyes of the jury. But considering the many blunders he made after Diane's death, causing him to be a PR nightmare, I'm sure his attorneys believed he would be a wild card on the stand. But it seems that based on how the information was presented to the jury by both sides, they simply did not believe that guns just go off. The fact that Tex was an experienced and passionate gun owner who owned almost 40 firearms made the suggestion of an accident doubtful for the jury. And it appears the jury did not feel the evidence about a sleep diagnosis of Tex's. The REM sleep disorder causes sudden involuntary movements during sleep, but the jury did not believe this was a sufficient explanation for the gun discharging if Tex's finger was on the trigger. In my episode on Tex and Diane, I noted that much was made by the prosecution of whether Tex would have had time to fall into REM sleep so quickly between asking for the gun and then Diane being shot. which was said to be around 10 minutes. But as I noted before, as witnessed by Danny Jo and Diane herself at the time, Tex kept nodding off, struggling to stay awake. And as we fall asleep, we can experience something called a hypnic jerk, which is a sudden muscle contraction. While the defense did explain Tex's sleep issues, I'm not sure they went into great detail to explain how he could have jerked and pulled the trigger. For example, in the Handbook of Clinical Neurology, the hypnic jerk is defined as, quote, "Hypnic jerks or sleep starts are normal physiological events occurring at the transition from wakefulness to sleep, often associated with sensory phenomena, such as a feeling of falling, unexplained alarm or fear, inner electric shock, or light flash. The most distinguishing feature of sleep starts is that they occur during drowsiness and the transition from wakefulness to sleep, before sleep onset." We don't know if the gun was cocked because Tex said he simply could not remember. If it was, which makes sense, given that Tex felt uncomfortable enough to ask Diane for the weapon, the amount of pressure required to discharge the firearm was less than 2 pounds. If it had not been cocked, the trigger would have needed 12 pounds of pressure. Even after taking all the evidence into account, the jury had clearly decided, rightly or wrongly, that Tex did harbor intent to some degree, based on the verdict for aggravated assault. Yet they found him not guilty of malice murder. I personally don't get why Executive Assistant DA Clint Rucker pushed back so hard against involuntary manslaughter or why the judge denied it. Juries need to have all the options. That was quite the gamble, in my opinion, and one which obviously paid off for the state. But one they would now come to regret. And yes, I'm doing the told you so dance in my head right now. I have talked about this gamble before, most recently in the Ray Carruth trial, in which the gamble did not work for the prosecution. I am more in favor of what I call kitchen sink charges. Give the jury every option. I believe it is so obviously much more fair to the defendant, but the problem as I see it is that the state and defense attorneys would often rather gamble with the defendants' lives in order to prove their theories right. And to be fair, the defense did not want the involuntary charge either initially. They wanted their client found not guilty on all charges. Again, a huge gamble with their client's life. But it could have gone either way for Tex, and really should have. A conviction on the lesser charge would still have carried prison time. Sure, it's not life, but for the state, a conviction against a prominent and affluent attorney still would have had an impact in one of the most high-profile, infamous trials Atlanta had ever seen. Plus, he was 73 years old. Chances are he still could have died in prison, even on the lesser charge. But the DA's gamble worked, and Tex was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 5 years for influencing a witness, to be served concurrently. For the weapons charge, he received a suspended 5-year sentence. Almost immediately, his legal team began preparing an appeal, filing a motion for a new trial in February 2020. When I released the original episode, a $10 million wrongful death lawsuit brought on behalf of Diane's estate, naming both Tex and Danny Jo, was still on foot. The suit alleged Danny Jo failed to drive in a safe manner, focusing on her decision to drive to the hospital and failure to call 911. While there's minimal information available about the outcome, including any impact on Danny Jo, it appears the suit was confidentially settled with Tex's insurance company in March 2020. Over a year later, in July 2021, Judge McBurney denied Tex's request for a new trial. Undeterred, the defense took their case to the Georgia Supreme Court in January 2022, arguing that Tex did not receive a fair trial for several reasons. One was how conflicted the jury clearly was when it came to the question of accident or murder. Judge McBurney's decision had meant there was no option for the jury to consider involuntary manslaughter, so they only had two choices. The defense proposed what the jury should have been presented with all along, the scenario where Tex negligently fell asleep with a loaded gun in his lap. If this had been considered, Tex would have possibly been convicted of the lesser charge. Instead of being sentenced to life in prison, the maximum he would have received would have been 12 months. The defense also argued that certain evidence at trial was prejudicial and therefore inadmissible, especially that relating to racial bias on Tex's part, as well as the prosecution's speculative portrayal of him as money-hungry. The Supreme Court ruled on this as follows, quote, "With respect to McIver's contentions as to improper argument by the state in which it was stated or implied that McIver harbored racial prejudice, we caution the state and the trial court to be mindful of the impropriety of such arguments if there is a retrial. We note particularly and with disapproval the prosecutor's display of a PowerPoint slide with a bullet point reading KKK during his closing argument. The state ultimately acknowledged that no evidence was produced at trial to support any inference that the Ku Klux Klan was relevant to this case." In addition, the defense claimed Judge McBurney should not have permitted jurors to examine the Ford expedition to see how the gun could have discharged. It was a compelling case for the defense. In June 2022, the Georgia Supreme Court unanimously reversed Texas convictions for felony murder and possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony. It was highly critical of the Fulton County DA's office, particularly flamboyant prosecutor Clint Rucker and Judge McBurney, in their failure to offer involuntary manslaughter as an option to the jury. According to Courthouse News, Justice Michael Boggs wrote in the court's unanimous decision, quote, "While the state's evidence was sufficient to support the appellant's conviction of murder, it also could have supported a finding that the appellant killed the victim without any intention of doing so." He added that any evidence brought by the state pertaining to intent was weak, therefore making proof of Tex's guilt not overwhelming or even strong. The court ruled that any evidence of intent on Tex's part was extremely weak. On the other hand, it found the evidence supporting his actions as negligent was much stronger, ruling, quote, "The jury could have concluded that the revolver was discharged as a result of being startled awake, reflexively or involuntary clutching of the bag holding the firearm, and inadvertently contacting the trigger." The DA's office, again, particularly Clint Rucker, also came under fire for improper comments at closing and some of the alleged prejudicial evidence brought against Tex. With the ball back in the DA's court, there was the option for no new charges to be brought and the case to be dismissed. Instead, prosecutors doubled down. In July 2022, they announced they would again try Tex for felony murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and possession of a firearm during a felony. But this time, involuntary manslaughter would be on the table for the jury to consider. 3 months later, in October, Tex's bond application was denied, again by Judge McBurney, who felt that the 78-year-old was a flight risk. Stated that as Tex was a man of means, again facing life in prison, there was strong incentive for him to flee the state and not return. Nor was Judge McBurney confident Tex would not try to influence witnesses or stay away from firearms. Part of Tex's proposed bond conditions was that he go live with his sister in Texas and return to Georgia for the trial. His attorneys filed a request for a second bond hearing ahead of the retrial, scheduled for September 2023. In February of that year, Tex temporarily surrendered his license to practice law in Georgia, pending the outcome of his trial. The court accepted Tex's surrender of his license in April. But things weren't going to be as straightforward the next time around as the prosecution hoped. Tex had requested bond on the basis that he required access to his defense team as well as medical assistance, given his age. His attorney, Don Samuel, stated Tex was experiencing issues with memory and communication, though there were no issues with competency. The prosecution pushed for bond to be denied. In mid-November 2023, Judge McBurney ruled that 80-year-old Tex would remain in Fulton County Jail while awaiting his retrial, which was due to begin in early December. Despite Tex's age, the judge noted that he had previously violated his bond for improperly seeking to influence a key witness, for which he was convicted. On December 4th, jury selection for the second trial got underway. Tex had the same defense team by his side as he had since day one: Bruce Harvey, Don Samuel, and Amanda Clark Palmer. But no sooner had things got going than they ground to a halt. In accordance with instructions from the Georgia Supreme Court and in response to a motion in limine, which is a motion discussed in the absence of the jury, arguing that evidence be included or excluded from trial, the prosecution was dealt a blow when Judge McBurney ruled that they could not present evidence arguing intent to kill. This was distinct from intent to shoot. Tex had already been acquitted of malice murder, after all. This meant that key aspects presented as part of the state's case at the first trial would now not be heard. The state would not be able to enter evidence about Diane's alleged second will unless they could prove Tex suspected his wife intended to decrease her husband's entitlements as a beneficiary. The state would first need to argue this point without the jury present. Judge McBurney stated the prosecution's evidence of a second will at the first trial was not particularly strong. According to the AJC, the judge stated that the prosecution failed to demonstrate that Tex knew of any such second will. Nor was the state allowed to mention Georgia's Slayer statute, which prevents convicted killers from profiting from the estate of their victim. Among the evidence the state could bring at retrial was Tex's behavior at the hospital and his attempts to both influence witnesses and bribe the then district attorney Paul Howard to drop the charges. The prosecution could also argue that Tex shot Diane in order to incapacitate her as a way to gain control over her assets as power of attorney. The defense wanted this argument excluded, but lost on this point. As for the speculation that Tex was having an affair, prosecutors would be able to introduce this evidence in terms of a possible motivation for the shooting, but Tex's alleged infidelity would have to be proven, and there was no proof. The prosecution announced it would appeal Judge McBurney's decision to the Supreme Court. Proceedings would again be delayed, this time until mid to late 2024, perhaps even indefinitely, according to the AJC. Again, Tex's defense team planned on requesting bond be granted. But late the following month, there was an unexpected development. On January 26, 2024, 81-year-old Tex McIver pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct, and possession of a firearm during a felony. There would be no retrial after all, as one of the highest-profile legal sagas in the state came to an end. At sentencing, Tex told the court, quote, "Diane's the best friend I ever had. She's the best partner I could possibly imagine, and I will always, always love her. She died as a result of my actions, plain and simple. I've worn my wedding ring since the day we were married, and I intend to wear it until the day I die. I hope we're at a point where we're not judging each other and we can all move on. She's my angel, and she's waiting for me in heaven." Others from Diane's life were also given the opportunity to speak. Her best friend, Danny Jo Carter, told the court Her life had all but been destroyed by Diane's death, saying, "The stress has been tremendous. I'm just angry." A statement by Diane's former boss, Billy Corey, was also read to the court, saying Diane's death, quote, "was no accident. One man, one hand, and one bullet ended her life and caused a lifetime of misery and loss for so many others. There will never be another Diane McIver. Diane was full of life, and she should never have been taken away from us in such a careless and malicious way. She is today missed as much as she was on that tragic day." In accordance with Tex's plea deal, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the last 7 years to be served on probation. He also had to agree to relinquish any entitlement to any civil settlement arising from Diane's death. With time already served and his 5-year sentence for influencing a witness completed, according to Tex's attorneys, he could be paroled prior to the end of his sentence in mid-2025. Given that Tex has already served at least 6 years in prison, this technically makes him eligible for parole right now. His attorneys told Atlanta News First that the plea deal was struck to bring an end to something that had now dragged on into its 8th year, with Don Samuel saying, "Anyone who thinks this was a well-planned murder, nobody could think that. It makes no sense to even think that was intentional or malicious. Whether it was reckless, whether you want to define it as gross negligence, or whether it was just simply an accident, that's debatable." Judge McBurney, too, seemed satisfied with what he described as a healthier and cleaner method of resolution that ultimately saved the state the cost of further proceedings, saying, "Mr. McIver shouldn't have had that loaded gun in his hand with his finger on the trigger. For those who seek purely punishment through this process, you're going to be disappointed." According to Atlanta News First, Tex will serve the first 5 years of his probation under home confinement with a 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. curfew. He is not to have any contact with Danny Jo Carter or Billy Corey. As I explained in my original episode, I do not believe Tex intended to kill his wife. I agree that much about Tex's actions after the fact did not look good, whatever way you try to spin it. He got a lot of bad advice and made a lot of stupid mistakes, but that doesn't make him a killer. I am probably pissing off my Atlanta area listeners who I know feel passionately about this case. Tex McIver is not popular there, but I'm sorry. I do believe the justice system finally worked right for this man and for Diane McIver. I just believe him. I always have. His story makes much more sense than a planned murder in his car in front of Diane's best friend. After my original episode aired, Tex found out about Southern Fried and his lawyer asked for a transcript of the episode so Tex could read it in prison since he was not allowed to listen to the podcast. Hopefully, he will be able to listen to this update soon. It's not clear exactly when Tex will be released on parole, but it seems it could literally be any day. And when he is, we can only hope that having done his time, he can continue processing his grief for his wife Diane and honoring her memory. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by me and Gemma Harris. As usual, any editorial comments and opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Scheck-Snyder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages, but please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm also on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.